Shalom. Hi, everyone. I'm Rav Aviad Tabory from Israel, from Alon Shvut. Nice to be here with you. Tomorrow night, we will be celebrating Tu B'Shvat. Last week, we discussed some of the minhagim that Am Yisrael kept during many centuries on Tu B'Shvat, and how different customs developed in the way we celebrate this special day. We mentioned the minhag, the custom of eating fruit of Eretz Yisrael. Today, I would like to focus on another custom that many of you in the UK probably have been doing for many years when you come to Israel, and that is to plant a tree. Many of you remember and recognize the special boxes of the JNF, Karen Kemet L'Yisrael, those boxes which were scattered all over the world in Jewish communities, which always asked Jews to give a bit of tzedakah, to buy land in Eretz Yisrael, but more important, to plant trees. Many people remember that for their bar mitzvah, their bat mitzvah, for special occasions, they were given some kind of document that said a tree was planted for your bar mitzvah, for your bat mitzvah. And for many years, Tu B'Shvat has been celebrated here in Israel as the day of planting trees. And the question really is, what is the meaning of this custom? Is it merely a technical one, a custom that developed because we need trees in the land of Israel? Is there any religious meaning behind this custom to plant a tree? Today, I would like to examine this custom and to prove that it has origins in our traditions, and its meaning, I think, has a very profound one in our tradition. There's a story that in the beginning of the 20th century, the chief rabbi of Israel, at the time, Rav Avram Yitzchak HaKohen Kook, the famous rabbi who was known to be a big lover of Zion, a big Zionist, he founded the chief rabbin of Israel and was the first Ashkenazi chief rabbi of this institution. He was invited to a celebration of planting trees in where we would call today Hod HaSharon. The people standing around Rav Kook noticed his excitement and how he took this very serious. And when he planted the tree and he was offered some tools to plant the tree, he refused the tools. Rather, he chose to plant the trees with his own fingers, with his own hands. And the people around him noticed that his face was as if on fire, and he was trembling with excitement as he was performing this act of planting a tree. And when someone dared to ask the rabbi, Rav Kook, it's just a tree, why are you getting so excited? And Rav Kook responded by quoting a midrash. The midrash refers to the pasuk in Sefer Bereshit. We are told in the beginning of the Torah in Sefer Bereshit that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Vayita Hashem gan, Vayita Hashem, I'll just quote the exact pasuk, Vayita Hashem gan be'eden mikedem. Hashem Elokim plants a tree in Gan Eden. And on this pasuk, the Midrash tells us that when you come into Eretz Yisrael, you also have to plant trees. And the Midrash tells us that planting trees is an attribute of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And we know that in Judaism, one of the more important principles of Judaism is for us to try and imitate the attributes and the characteristics of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Midrash tells us elsewhere that we must learn from God to behave in the way He behaves. It says that God visited the sick when He visited Avram. We should try to visit the sick. It says that God buried Moshe, and therefore we also should bury the dead, meaning the Midrash teaches us that a person should always strive to imitate the ways of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and to follow his ways and how he does things in this world is something to teach us how we should behave ourselves. Says Rav Kook, when we plant a tree here in Eretz Yisrael, we are imitating the ways of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We are doing something, we are fulfilling a religious tradition of planting trees in Gan Eden being, of course, the Eretz Yisrael of today, being the parallel of what Gan Eden was. And like God planted trees, so are we planting trees. However, I would like to suggest a deeper meaning into the meaning of planting trees, especially today in the land of Israel. And I'm referring now to another pasuk in the Torah, in Sefer Vayikra. In Sefer Vayikra, we read how God tells his people that in the future there will be terrible times. Kadosh Baruch Hu, in the Torah, lists a list of terrible events that will occur to the Jewish people in the future if they don't follow God. Amongst different psukim that describe these terrible events, there's one pasuk that stands out. In Vayikra, chapter 26, verse 32, it says the following: Vashimoti ani et haaretz v'shamemu alea oivechem hayoshvim ba. God says, I will desolate the land, and the enemy will find the land desolate. That is the pasuk in Vayikra. If you try to understand this pasuk from its context, it seems that this is just another description, another detail in the terrible churban, destruction that will occur in Jewish history if we don't obey God and follow his laws. We will be scattered around the world, we will be led into exile, and as a result, the land will be desolate. And that is a common way of interpretation of this pasuk. And for example, the Ibn Ezra, the famous commentator on Chumash, agrees that this is the meaning of this pasuk. However, other commentators, amongst them Rashi and the Ramban, disagree. I will read to you what Rashi says on this pasuk. Rashi says, this is a good measure, meaning this is a positive, almost blessing, a matter of benefit for Israel, for the Jewish people. This is a matter of benefit for the Jewish people. Why? For it will be desolate of its inhabitants, and the enemies will not find the land, a land which they can live on. In a similar way, the Ramban also agrees to this commentary, and he explains this is also a great proof and assurance for us. For in the whole inhabited part of the world, one cannot find such a good and large land which was always lived in, and yet is as ruined as it is today. For since the time that we have left, says the Ramban, it has not accepted any nation or people. They have all tried to settle it, but to no avail. Notice that the Ramban is not just explaining the pasuk, he's actually adding a bit of historical proof to back up this idea. And I'll explain. Rashi said that this pasuk is a bracha, is a blessing. Why? Because as a result of the exile and as a result of the Jews leaving the land, it could very well be that other nations around the world will use the opportunity to come to Israel and settle the land. And after many years that we would like to return to the land of Israel, we will find it full of cities, of people living here, which would obviously create a big problem of how we would be able to settle in the land. Therefore, explains Rashi, the Torah is telling us, although you will be taken into exile, although things will be very difficult, I assure you, says God, I promise you, says God, the land will remain desolate. And the Ramban adds, not only is this a bracha, not only is this a blessing and a promise of God, I, the Ramban, I'm telling you that this is correct, this is true, because the Ramban in the 13th century made his way to Eretz Yisrael. The Ramban, as a result of his famous dispute that he had in public, had to run away from Europe, and he made his way. The last 3 years of his life, he made his way to Israel, and we have letters that he wrote to his son Nachman, in which he describes his astonishment to come to land of Israel and to find it one big desert. He describes that there's nothing growing here. He describes swampy land. He even tells us that when he came to Yerushalayim, and he looked like any good Jew would look for a minyan in the streets of Yerushalayim, he could not even find 10 Jews for a minyan. And the Ramban had to gather people and bring people from outside in order to establish a shul. He even writes how he bought and started a shul in the old city. That's why, by the way, till today, there is a shul in the old city, you may have been there, called the Ramban Shul. I don't think it's the original building of the Ramban, but it was named the Ramban to commemorate the Ramban's original establishing of a shul in the old city, as he writes in his letters. So not only is the Ramban telling us that this is a promise of God, he actually is testifying that the promise is true, and that even in the dark years of exile, we can find some silver lining, some bracha, that although we are in exile, no nation has succeeded in growing anything in this land. It's still swampy land. Nothing is growing in the country. What's fascinating is that this testimony is mentioned, a similar testimony is brought down by none other than Sam Clements, who I'm sure people have heard of him because his pen name was Mark Twain. Mark Twain, the famous author, made a trip in the 19th century, and on his visit to the land of Israel, he describes the situation here in the land of Israel. In his book called Innocents Abroad, he describes, again, his astonishment, as just like the Ramban's, of finding a land which is completely barren, desolate. Nothing is growing here. He talks about the spell of a curse that had withered its fields and fettered its energies. He talks about Sodom and Amorah as if continuing to be there. There's nothing alive there. Nothing is alive there. Weeds, he describes. Treacherous fruit. He says, he describes the desert of Jericho, that cursed lies, a moldering ruin. He talks about Jerusalem has lost all its ancient grandeur and has become a pauper village. The riches of Solomon are no longer there to compel the admiration of visiting Oriental queens. The wonderful temple, which was the pride and glory of Israel, is gone. Palestine is desolate and unlovely. The curse remains on the land. This is a description of Mark Twain visiting Israel in the 19th century. Many other visitors during those years between the Ramban, 13th century, and the visit of Mark Twain also describe the land of Israel as being desolate, just proving that the bracha of the Torah here came true. It's as if the land of Israel sensed that the Jewish people are not living here, and it is as if the land itself would not give any other nation, any other people, the opportunity to grow anything in this land. One of my great teachers, Professor Shalom Rosenberg from Hebrew University, used to talk about this idea and explain it by using the famous children's tale of the Sleeping Beauty. And he used to say that the Sleeping Beauty story is actually a mashal, a parable for what we just said now. The princess was cursed and went to sleep for 100 years. During those 100 years, the kingdom went to sleep, and it was desolate. And then many princes from all over the world came and tried to wake up the princess. Each one of them trying different methods, but each one of them failing. Says Professor Rosenberg, during hundreds of years, different tribes, nations, people came to try to settle the land. They all tried, but they weren't able to waken up the princess. The land remained in ruins. Till the big end of the 19th century, with the first Aliyah, and we know when the first Aliyah, when the people in 1880s came here to the land of Israel, they had to deal with malaria and typhus. They had to deal with swamps. And yet, after a lot of hard work, a lot of Mesirat Nefesh, they were able to awaken the land. Suddenly, trees are growing, bushes, grass. Suddenly, the land is awakening as if from this 2,000 year of course. It's as if, again, the land of Israel recognized that its children have come home, and it's allowing them to grow trees, flowers, bushes, grass on its land, as if it has a mind of its own. This bracha, which has come true in our times, means that Am Yisrael, the people of Israel, and the land of Israel have a special bond, have a special connection. They both need each other. The Jewish people need the land, and the land needs the people. In order for the land to grow, it needs Am Yisrael to be here. And in order for Am Yisrael to do what it's supposed to do, it needs to be on the land of Israel. Rav Kook, in the book Light, Orot, writes about this idea, explaining how both the Jewish people and the land of Israel both need each other in order for them to do what they're supposed to do, what they're expected to do. This takes us back to the beginning of our shir today. We spoke about the meaning of planting trees in the land of Israel. The meaning, according to what we just said now, of planting a tree in Israel is that if the tree succeeds, it is a sign almost of the redemption. It's a sign of Am Yisrael returning to the land of Israel, planting trees, reviving the land, bringing it back to be alive. Tu B'Shvat, for many years, was a Chag, was a day in which Jews thought and yearned about Eretz Yisrael. However, nowadays, it is a day that we can actually celebrate the fact that Jews came back to the land, are planting trees. Look around the land of Israel. You will see houses, towns, roads, forests, trees blossoming with fruit. That is the sign that the Jewish people have come back to the land of Israel. By planting a tree, you are acknowledging that we have returned back to the land of Israel. In fact, the Gemara in Masechet Sanhedrin asks a question, which I think we all want to know the answer to this question. And the question is, when will Mashiach come? How will we know that the Messiah, that Mashiach is here? How will we know that we are living in days of redemption? And the Gemara answers an answer which at first glance seems very strange. Quoting a pasuk from the Tanakh, the Gemara explains, if you see the trees of Israel producing fruit, that is the sign that the Geula, that the redemption is already here at the door. You ask yourself, since when is a tree producing fruit a symbol of redemption? Look around the world. Every country has trees full of fruit. What's so special? The answer is because for 2,000 years, the trees of Israel were not producing fruit. And if they are producing fruit, that is a sign that Am Yisrael have returned, because the land of Israel will not allow as if its trees to produce fruit unless its children have returned to the land. That is a sign, according to Gemara, that we are in the beginning of a process of redemption in which we celebrate the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. And therefore, planting trees is participating in the acknowledgement that we have returned home to Eretz Yisrael. Have a wonderful Tu B'Shvat. Celebrate wherever you are. Kol Tuv.